Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have John Adams back on the show. John returns to discuss, well, California. California, the Golden State. Of course, John is the co-host of the Hoaxbusters Call and also the Hoaxbusters Special Reports. He does those with Chris Kendall. John, how are you doing?
Doing well, Tim. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, I thought I'd have you back on to talk. You've done a number of shows about California, sort of as a laboratory for social engineering, culture creation. Of course, in California, we have entertainment, Hollywood, the music industry, and the various cults that sprung out of California, the Manson family, Similes Liberation Army, and of course the think tanks, SRI, Rand Corporation, Esalen Institute. A big military-industrial complex. You've done a lot on the role of aerospace and American culture in the Cold War, and also the state as a trendsetter. So all this research on California, so how do you want to get into this?
Well, it's good to be back on Our Interesting Times. It's one of the podcasts I still listen to. Yeah, California, I lived there for 40 years of my life, just recently moved out of the state.
That's right, you're a refugee, right, from the state?
I am, and for good reason, considering my hometown of Orange, California, there on the, what would be the north side of the Santa Ana River bank, there is a 2 to 3 mile long tent city that is right down the street from Anaheim Stadium now. So yeah, literally, turning it into the rich people live on the hill and the tent city exists. I mean, it's gonna look like Bangladesh soon or something like that. But as far as the history of Southern California goes and its role in trend setting, as you were alluding to, California, for the most part, prior to the 20th century, was an agricultural region. Primarily anything, I guess you could even include oil in that. As agriculture. But yeah, Orange County, California is named Orange County because it was once orange groves, avocados, beets, lima bean fields extending all the way into Los Angeles. As the 1800s rolled on, towns started to pop up, and you could technically sort of look at this as kind of a natural thing, a grassroots type thing where people are, buying farms, buying land, and they're turning it into farmland, and people start moving into certain areas because the farmland's expanding and the agricultural business at that time is booming. Another thing that was a very popular thing that was out of there that people might not remember or wouldn't think of California as being known for was eucalyptus oil. Lots of eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees and orange groves used to grow side by side. So the point being is that by the time you get into the 20th century, all of a sudden somebody just gets the idea somewhere that all of this agriculture is going to go away. We're going to get rid of that entirely, and we're going to build a massive grid of suburbs and industrial buildings and downtown Los Angeles. If you look back at old pictures of downtown Los Angeles, where the giant, massive skyscrapers are today, there used to be Victorian houses there. So the way that that California was set up, or even the surrounding land today in Los Angeles, it doesn't, that part of LA with the high rises, the rest of LA doesn't look like that. It's a grid of industrial buildings and just suburban landscape for the most part. So why was it that all of a sudden that changed? Like, you see, that's a very, I think that's a very interesting question, is how do you go from being one of the biggest agricultural producers in the nation to totally wiping all of that out so that you can become the most, some of the most expensive real estate in the world for the purpose of just building houses. Okay? Another example would be that the city of Garden Grove, which is not too far away from the Los Angeles County line, still in Orange County though, was once the hub of chili production. It was also the hub of egg production. So there is a chili that is called an Anaheim chili. It's a green chili, and it's actually called the Anaheim chili. If you go to your grocery store, you'll see a jalapeno, you'll see a serrano, and you'll see an Anaheim. The reason it's called an Anaheim chili is because it was cultivated in Anaheim, California, in a time period which Garden Grove and Anaheim and the city of Orange all share they're just a couple miles apart from each other. The point I'm making here is at a certain point, there's never, in the history books, there's never a reason given as to why this all of a sudden became an interest in selling off farmland and turning it into real estate for homes. Once again, the surrounding area, even up until the time when I was a little kid, used to, and there's still remnants of this in different pockets, but California used to be covered in oil derricks, Southern California. Long Beach, all the beaches in Los Angeles, it was oil production up and down. I mean, Huntington Beach, when I was a kid, still had oil derricks on the beach.
Yeah, we saw that in that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, right? There Will Be Blood.
Oh, yes.
It's California, yeah.
Yeah, so the that's all gone. There's no more oil derricks on the beach anymore. There are oil pumps. Long Beach in the Signal Hill area of Long Beach, they still have oil, the oil mules, as they're called. And there is still oil fields there, but it's very contained. It's not it's not the same as it used to be. And the places where some of those oil fields are, there's now suburban tract homes. Mm-hmm. So why did this all go away? And then this is a very interesting thing that I started to notice, is that this time period of this mass suburbanization, which is documented in multiple books, one being a book by an author named D.J. Waldy, and it's called Holy Land, A Suburban Memoir, and it's the history of Lakewood, California. And they basically, there were other suburbs built around the country, and suburbs have a different connotation in other time periods. So you used to have a town, and then maybe some houses were built around the outer perimeter of the town. And in the late 1800s or early 1900s, that may have been known as like a suburb to a certain extent. But the way that we think of suburbs today comes from Lakewood, California. Deer Park, Michigan is roughly around the same time they're starting to build that, but they're doing it for the same reason. Okay, Deer Park is built for the auto workers. Mm-hmm. Lakewood was built for the people who worked at Douglas Aircraft. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they literally started building these houses to house the people who were going to work at Douglas Aircraft. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Panorama City out in the valley. The difference between something like Deer Park, Michigan, or Levittown in New York, Catholic Town, as it was called at one time. The difference is something like Lakewood and Panorama City. I think Panorama City, it was something like 40,000 homes were built at one time. And Lakewood was a close second. I can't remember the exact amount, but Lakewood was built first, I believe. And it was the first of what you would call a master plan community. And so it coincides with this venture into World War II. Prior to this, California had an influx of immigrants. Not immigrants from other countries, immigrants from another state, and other states later. The prime one being Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. The grapes of wrath.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Now, we know that the Okies came in, and, if you've seen, the movie with Henry Fonda or read John Steinbeck's novel, that's one part of it. The other part of it is that during the Dust Bowl, Okies flocked to Southern California and worked in the oil fields of Southern California. But they were perfect people, and they even called them Aviation Okies. That was a nickname for them. They were perfect people for working in the warehouses and facilities of the aviation plants like Lockheed Martin out in Panorama City and Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, California, which Lakewood is built right next to.
Yeah, at this time, the aviation industry is being largely driven by political events, war. It's not a...
Absolutely. And in some of those talks that you were alluding to that Chris and I did on these subjects, the one I gave a funny little name to, a hat tip to Bertrand Russell. Not that I like Bertrand Russell, but I called it the impact of aviation, the impact of aerospace on society.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not so sure, me being a skeptic, and not a skeptic in the Michael Shermer sense of the word, a real skeptic.
The most gullible skeptic out there is Michael Shermer.
Exactly. Yeah. Skeptic means towing the official establishment line. That's what it means.
He's only skeptical about people who are skeptical.
I know. Yeah, that's literally what that magazine is put out there for. It's a skeptic magazine devoted to debunking conspiracy theories. So, me being a skeptic here, I'm looking at this, and it was interesting to kind of put this in context. I'll come around. I'll do a full 180 here on this. So, Chris Kendall, my good buddy at hoaxbusterscall.com, had done some talks and came to the conclusion that the Dust Bowl was manufactured. And the reason he came to this conclusion is because the 40 acres and a mule wasn't enough land for the people to be able to turn the soil enough times to keep it farmland.
So basically, they couldn't do proper crop rotation, is what you're saying. Yeah.
They couldn't do proper crop rotation. It ended up creating this dust bowl. The banks were able to take back the land, and then once it had sat for a while, it was, viable land again. Mm-hmm. So the banks were able to foreclose on all these poor people who moved out there with the idea that they were going to turn all of this into some, utopia. And
so what you're saying is like the Great Depression, it was a pump and dump in order to eventually consolidate through bankruptcy and foreclosure.
That, and to, you may have heard of this before. I'm not. I think a lot of people in this day and age would know exactly what I was talking about. Is to create an economic crisis to facilitate an influx of immigration. You ever heard of that before?
Yeah, Weaponized Migration, I think is a book called by that title. Kelly Greenwald.
So let's say we're leading up to World War II here, and we're going to need a bunch of people to work in our war factories. We're going to have these war factories out on the West Coast there, and the influx of the people who would be perfect for this would be these farm hands, these ranch hands, and all these people get bankrupted and they all move out to the West Coast right in time to be the workers who would work in the aerospace facilities. It all kind of flows together very perfectly. The other interesting thing is that, you see, the aerospace industry being facilitated in the on the West Coast is kind of strange for the time period, because there is no industry on the West Coast except for agriculture. Most of the industry prior to World War II is based out of the East Coast.
Yeah, and Midwest with the Ford plants and things like that.
And yes. Yeah. So it's just like if you think of steel, you think of Pittsburgh in the old days, right? Mm-hmm. So for this to kind of happen out there doesn't make sense unless you actually have people out there to do it. And like I said, this influx of immigrants from Oklahoma and later Texas and even southern states, all these people move out to California. Those are people who had never lived there before, and the population grew. I'd have to check my notes here, but the population grew extensively, massively.
You also have, along with the Dust Bowl, you have the Great Depression and some of the alphabet soup relief efforts carried out by the Roosevelt administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA.
Absolutely.
Would acclimate or socialize or people to working sort of in a boot camp environment, militarized environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. My good buddy Chris has talked about that many times. Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression helped to create the mindset for people to actually go into war. So the men who weren't really within that mindset prior to World War II, when we miraculously got into World War II, I don't think that's any mystery as to what happened there. You have this group of these men who are already kind of primed for that way of life. They're already primed for what they're going to be doing. It also gave people a sense of purpose that was kind of lacking during the Great Depression as well.
Yeah, you could look at the Great Depression as sort of a early version of shock doctrine.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a, depress everybody, bring everybody down, and then leave everybody hopeless, and then the war comes in, and it's this huge manufactured economic boom out of nothing, literally out of nothing. And all of a sudden, these people who have been psychologically traumatized by this depression, just like all of us have been for the past 10 years, now you've got this sense of purpose. Now you've got this promise of prosperity. Now you've got big, nice, new, clean grids of houses being built everywhere. New, everything's going to be new. The atomic age. But here's some notes I wrote down from when I was doing those calls. So leading up to World War I and World War II, aerospace in and of itself is being cultivated in Los Angeles. And the culture that we're being moved through, there's this kind of, how do I put it? Aviation and flying coincides with modernism.
Yeah.
Okay, it's this idea of conquering the new frontier, and you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I can see those old films like with huge dirigibles, right?
It's
futuristic,
very
Fritz Lang type stuff. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
it's very modern. It's so that's the kind of mindset you have to have when taking in what we're going to talk about. So it says the LA International Aviation Meet was on January 10th, 1910. It was the first air show in the U.S. Over the next 100 years, aerospace industry transformed Southern California from an agricultural region to a sprawling high-tech nexus. Southern California would not exist without aerospace. Millions of people moved to Southern California for aerospace jobs, shaping the politics, culture, physical landscape, religions. By the 1980s, Southern California was home to 40% of the U.S. missile and space business. 1/3 of aerospace engineers and 500,000 people were employed in Southern California. Hear that? 1/3 of aerospace engineers were employed in Southern California. Understanding California aerospace is not just weather related. You have to consider the long history of civic boosters, newspaper publishers, Hollywood, investment in local universities, supplied research for local military bases. Okay, so that was another thing. Is USC, UCLA, University of San Diego. This was a time period as well where, as the military-industrial complex moved into these areas, this is when you started to see the tech school pop up. Mm-hmm. So the school where you used to go to get your, philosophy or your civics or whatever it was that you just did, like my grandmother, I've given this example on calls before. My grandmother graduated from UCLA. Okay. She was a housewife. She didn't go to college to get her vocation.
Yeah, and colleges have become increasingly more vocational. You get the degree or at least in theory, because the people who are graduating now aren't really doing much with their degrees. But
Well, yes.
Yeah.
So like I said, my grandmother went to college because that's what she did. Mm-hmm. You went there to get an education, whatever. I'm not saying it's the greatest thing in the world. I'm just saying that at that time period, that's at least what the culture was and what people thought. You went there and you weren't going there for the purpose of a vocation. Now, my grandfather, on the other hand, who also went to UCLA, that's where he met my grandmother, he did go there for a vocation. He went there for an education, and then he went to the tech school and became an engineer. So this is around the time when they're starting to do this. And what this has been talked about before is how much of the research that is done for the government is passed out to universities. Mm-hmm. This starts around this time period, mostly. There was some certain things, and a lot of it originates in Southern California, Caltech being one of the first ones. Because Caltech and JPL are basically the same thing. Caltech is JPL, and JPL is Caltech. Interestingly enough, though, Caltech, you know what Caltech really started doing? And if anybody wants to read an interesting book on this, you can go get the book, The Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay. It's basically a history of Caltech and how they were studying eugenics.
Yeah.
Okay, so Caltech literally started, with eugenics and, the beginnings of microbiology. Mm-hmm. And then JPL comes out of Caltech at the same time.
Which, so you have, that's Jet Propulsion Laboratories, right?
Yes.
And that's ties into Scientology, right?
A little bit later, another California.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit later. So the culture of imagination is cultivated in California, and individualism. The airplane modernized the world. It connected the world, and it was it left, and Southern California left a distinctive stamp on aerospace. There's an argument that the direction that aerospace took couldn't have been possible in any other place except for California. And the reason being was there is a connection with California to the Old West and conquering the frontier. Mm-hmm. So in that time period, there is this imagery that's attached to it, and it connects with the imagery that has been provided for us of the Old West. It's connected to the past. It's kind of a deep thing that was provided for people who were in this field. There's this frontier conquering connection. And so you get these people like Jack Northrop and, Lockheed Martin, like I said, was out here. That's where Amelia Earhart was flying out of.
I guess this is sort of a continuation of the Transcontinental Railroad. I think when the 1869 is when they finally made the final connection, this sort of conquest of distance through the trains.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that because if the Northrop Grumman plant, the original one, it's still down there in El Segundo, California, and so if you go down to El Segundo, I'm jumping all over the place, but I don't mind. It's going to all make sense. Mm-hmm. Go down to El Segundo, California, Northrop Grumman, which is in Redondo Beach, which is right next to El Segundo. If you just hop over a couple of blocks, you got Raytheon. Oh, can you hear me, Tim?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, you got it back. Okay.
It dropped out for a second.
You were clear the whole time, so.
Okay, so Northrop Grumman is down the street from Raytheon, which is down the street from not Lockheed. What's the other one?
General Dynamics?
Boeing.
Boeing, okay.
Yeah, they're all basically in the same vicinity of each other, right down there.
Yeah, all these competitors.
All the competitors, yeah, they're all competing, and they're all built in the same city, blocks away from each other. And across the street from that is Chevron Corporation. And Oracle's built right there too, and ING, the Dutch bank, is all right. The Royal House of Orange Bank is right there. These are all there's a big military banking industrial complex area right down there in El Segundo. And these would be the people who would push not only California, but would push the country into the future. They're manufacturing this new economy into existence, which is based off of warfare.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also being sold as like we're conquering, the skies, and we're conquering it, and connecting it to what you were saying with the railroads. The streets down there, when you get down near the beach, are Harriman, Harkness, Rockefeller, Carnegie.
You're right.
That's the street names. All when you get down into the Manhattan Beach area, they're named after Harkness and Harriman are the railroad tycoons, and Rockefeller and Carnegie are.
I think Stanford, right? Leland Stanford was a.
Oh yeah,
railroad mogul. So.
Oh yeah, Huntington Beach is named after Samuel P. Huntington. So, the Huntingtons and the Stanfords and all those guys. The West Coast has their own set of robber barons, not just the East Coast. In fact, the oil company that was originally out here was Pacific Gas. And Pacific Gas is Standard Oil. So the oil out here was always a Rockefeller thing from the get-go. And Rockefeller plays a part in the Bay Area as well, interestingly enough. But continuing with this, between 1920 and 1940, the growth doubled the aerospace growth doubled the population between 1920 and 1940. So the population doubled from 20 to 40, and it doubled again from 40 to 60. Okay, so let's think about those time periods.
Mm-hmm.
Aerospace growth doubled the population between 20 and 40. All right, so what's going on between 1920 and 1940? The end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. It doubled again from 1940 to 1960. What do you have between that 20 years? The beginning of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? This growth is being facilitated by the war-based economy, by the Cold War threat. That's the sole that's the only reason anybody has any reason to be moving out to California at this time period. Okay, they're tearing down the avocado groves, the walnut groves, the eucalyptus trees. They're all being torn down to build houses. There's no more agriculture. Okies are not going out there to, pick oranges anymore. They're going out there to put, to put rivets in planes.
Mm-hmm.
Los Angeles had the highest concentration of white Protestants amongst the 20 largest U.S. cities in 1960. right? Now, everybody thinks of Hollywood and Los Angeles as, being some bastion of liberal, leaning. At one time, from the South Bay all the way down in Orange County, it was, the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Aerospace shaped religious landscape. There was a scarcity of Catholics in science and engineering. No offense, Tim. Kidding. Political shape. Aerospace reinforced conservative political orientation in Southern California. Migrant waves reversed the eastern middle class and western settlers. Aviation Okies came first, which created the conservative landscape. The Okies brought traditional values, evangelical work ethic, and hundreds of thousands of these people had national security clearances and signed non-disclosure agreements to not discuss work with their family or anyone else. This had a broader social impact. Secrecy plus democracy. So this is a very interesting thing that's taking place, especially during the Cold War, is you have people who are moving out here and they've got this, like we talked about the last time we've talked, you've got this kind of hybrid religion that's being built up. Part of it is manufactured, as we discussed, and part of it has taken on its own kind of momentum because you have these people who are driven by prosperity on one hand, so you've got kind of this prosperity gospel, and they've got these, backgrounds in Baptist churches and, Southern type leanings and whatnot. And at the same time, you've got this Cold War background that is providing this, and as we were discussing how the churches play into all this, especially out here, it's being cultivated and hybridized to facilitate this idea of equating, Satan with communism and mm-hmm. Jesus with capitalism, right? And then you've got the added thing of these people are working in these, they're working in this field of aerospace where where a lot of stuff is secret. And it's secret because there's this Cold War threat.
Mm-hmm. Right? And I suspect highly compartmentalized as well. Highly
compartmentalized. In fact, there were cases in these books that I was reading where both husband and wives, I speculate that these were, I speculate that this was lab testing on people, that this type of stuff was studied. There were cases where the husband had a security clearance and so did the wife, and they both worked on different projects. And they couldn't talk to the other one about the projects that they were working on.
Makes for awkward pillow talk, doesn't it?
Well, not only that, it contributes to all of this. You can read critiques of the suburbs and mm-hmm. Organizational culture and all that type of stuff. Which you and I have discussed on past calls about 2 years ago. And like in those talks, you and I are critical of that way of life, but we also realize that is a laboratory. It was planned out, it was mapped out for people like what we're discussing here to live in. This contribute, so you can read a critique of that culture and kind of agree with it to a certain extent. But this contributed to certain types of isolation mm-hmm. and fear. Neighborhood watch programs. You know what those are, right?
Yeah, the sign with the eye.
yeah, neighborhood watch. those come out of the Neighborhood Watch program is born out of looking for communists in your neighborhood.
Well, they could be anybody. They could be your next door neighbor, your best friend. Right?
That's right. So the Neighborhood Watch, when I was a kid, I thought the Neighborhood Watch was all about like looking for like pedophiles or perverts or something, right? Or like people trying to break cars.
Yeah, imagine like street crime, which is the only practical, which existed anyway in a neighborhood that was like cohesive and homogenous because you had high trust, people knew each other, they related to each other. So it in effect occurred anyway because you had people, just walking. They knew what was normal, what wasn't, and they were involved in people's lives, so they knew if something was untoward or not normal, So
yes. But the Neighborhood Watch program comes out of, you got to be looking around if you see any suspicious, if you see anybody like, wearing berets in your suburb and they're, driving like a van, they're driving a van, they've got berets on and then,
they don't like baseball.
they don't like baseball. Yeah. So, suburbia aerospace and suburbia contributed to religious and political culture, and that in turn helped aerospace to thrive. It encouraged conservatism in the Cold War atmosphere. Aerospace was not technically conservative, though. Now that's an interesting thing right there. It's actually the liberalism of California that allowed the innovation of technology, whether it's aerospace or whether it's Silicon Valley.
Yeah. The libertine view of things, yeah. Yes.
So what we kind of look at as quote-unquote conservatism or that type of stuff, it's still got this kind of libertarian kind of leaning to it to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it would be positioned is, and we're going to get into this in a moment here, it's still pushing this idea of rugged individualism. And this rugged individualism is going to be attached to this conquering of the frontier. And even though that rugged individual thing has been pushed for a long time, and that rugged individual who once existed, he was actually an organization man. So you become the organization man, and the new frontier that you're conquering is the frontier of business, it's the frontier of aerospace, it's the frontier of whatever, right? But it's done within the context of the business world or the highly organized world. It's no longer the rugged individual who's conquering the plains. They're now using plains to conquer rugged individualism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I meant plains as in Plains, the plains.
Yeah. These are the guys you see, like the old pictures where they're wearing horn-rimmed glasses, white shirts, and a thin black necktie, and they all work in the IBM type guys,
exactly.
The gray flannel suit, the types of guys you see in the late 50s or 60s, working on.
Absolutely. So Richard Neutra, who was a architect, and we can talk about that stuff in a minute. Richard Neutra said Southern California's mindset was more mentally footloose than anywhere else. Innovation thrived off of individualism, and it produced techno-futurism. Yet aerospace produced people like Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and science fiction of Los Angeles like Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury.
Mm-hmm.
Silicon Valley was created by the aerospace industry and the counterculture, i.e. the CIA. Conservative plus liberal equals aerospace, futurism, and transhumanism. So why Southern California? Aerospace procurement, underwriting, investment in electronics manufacturing, which dominated, switched from airframe to avionics and electronics. Okay, this is a theory that I have, and someone may think this is crazy, but I'm just proposing it. I believe, after looking at all this stuff, and we can go on to a different subject if you'd like, but I believe that the purpose of actually creating the modern day aerospace world was to actually cultivate the microprocessor for computers. Because the microprocessors that they were using in the planes is the exact same one that they started using in computers. And I was starting to think about it a little bit, and I'm all, wow, I wonder if using the chips, the early microchips in planes was a cover for building the internet.
Yeah, because it was a DARPA project. Yeah, and
yeah.
That was 1971.
Well, this is even earlier because they're in the 60s. They're already using the microprocessor, like I said, in airplanes. In like the jets, in the, I can't remember the names of all those jets. I'm not a jet person, but the early high tech jets there.
Mm-hmm. U-2 plane or something, or
no, the ones
XJ-25 or something.
Yeah, like the ones they're flying in Vietnam and stuff.
Yeah.
Early, 60s. Yeah, so I was just thinking about that. I'm all, yeah, it's the exact same one they're using in the computers. So, it's quite possible that was kind of, because that was a secret project to develop those things for computers.
Mm-hmm.
And what they make it sound like in the history books is like, it's like, oh yeah, we had these things for the planes here, and they just happened to work out real good for the computers after we were. And it's like, oh really? Huh.
Oh, that yeah,
just
like the application of military industrial technology to consumer goods or to the civilian sector. The same thing with the space programs, things like that. Whether it's
yeah. Yeah, another thing here in my notes is that I said that the creativity was filtering into our culture. Infrared started being used by police.
Mm-hmm.
Telecommunications code theory for deep space used to build cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
And the cell phone industry comes out of Southern California. Southern California had the open route to imagination through popular culture. The movie business had aerospace connections from its inception.
Well, that's the important point, because the obviously you're talking about the effect that aerospace technology is having on the culture in California. But then again, you have the infrastructure in California to promote this culture, radiate it throughout the country through Hollywood and TV, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You are always able to articulate something much better than I. So I appreciate that. The movie business had aerospace connections from its inception, CGI, atomic housewares, music, space age pop television, I Dream of Jeannie, the Jetsons.
Yes.
Hot rods. If you think about hot rod culture and where we get the modern day muscle cars and all NASCAR and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, the automobile culture in general, California is big in promoting that. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, the way that hot rods and racing started, they started racing on airstrips.
Yes, a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
the engineers actually designed manifolds and camshafts.
And, I mean, your overall theory about technology being planned, the applications technology for the internet and computers, and then somehow the social engineers thinking how this is going to transform society via technology. You had a recent talk on that, which was very good, on this very topic. I recommend people go listen to that, about the effects of technology that they do, whether it's good or bad, has an effect. The question of whether these effects or this impact is planned. And we have examples in other areas where it was planned. And one thing is, we mentioned the automobile culture. Of course, that was planned. That was developed, or at least facilitated through the development of the interstate highway system. And there was a plan back in it started in the late 1930s to 1950, with, I think it was General Motors, and they created this company, National City Lines, which was a conspiracy to destroy urban transport systems like the trolley cars, electric cars, to boost sales of automobiles, of diesel buses, boost petroleum sales. And of course, at this time, the person who's overseeing the construction interstate highway system is this guy Charles Wilson, the former head of GM. And it was developed as a military measure, supposedly. That was the excuse, but it fundamentally changed society because it facilitated the diaspora into suburbia and the consumer culture and the automobile culture. So my point is that these things are planned out for automobiles, and housing. So why wouldn't it be planned out for something like transistors or the microprocessor?
Absolutely. And just to back up what you were saying, on page 276 of a book that, if anybody's interested in these subjects, there's a book called American Eden. It's written by Wade Graham. It's called From Monticello to Central Park to Our Backyards, What Gardens Tell Us About Who We Are. Now, that might sound like a boring title, but it's actually a very interesting book. It says, he says here, suburbanization didn't just happen magically, nor was it simply chosen by consumers or ordained by free market forces. Isn't that an interesting thing to start off a sentence with?
Yeah.
Especially in a non-conspiratorial book. So he says, let me read it again. Suburbanization did not just happen magically, nor was it simply chosen by consumers or ordained by free market forces. The conversion of rural land to suburban housing development has always been a process stoked, shaped, and sustained by government policies. Not a single coherent or necessarily intentional. He says it's not a single coherent or necessarily intentional one, but many overlapping ones promulgated by different parts of government in many levels, local, state, and national. It is a Kafkaesque bureaucratic morass of cross purposes that is singularly American, and to which we owe a good part of our built environment. I agree with Graham's statement there, and yet I disagree with it. But backing up what you were saying, you just jogged my memory as you were talking about this. The next page, 277, he says, at the federal level, the list of inducements to decentralization in the post-war period is long. A redirection of defense spending from north to the Sun Belt, massive spending on roads extending from the Federal Highway Act of 1916 to the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which by itself opened millions of acres to subdivision. The deduction of mortgage interest and real estate taxes from gross income, reimbursement for state and local government building of new water, sewer, and other infrastructure, and massive government spending on housing after the Depression in the form of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration insuring mortgages. The federal government made it literally cheaper to buy in the suburbs than to rent in the cities, and millions did. So, that backs up exactly what you said and adds the added caveat of that we were not only was the highways built for the purpose of getting automobiles, but the suburbs were built for the purpose of getting people out of the cities and into the suburbs, out of the neighborhoods, which you've talked about that many times.
Yeah, this is the changing the demographics to change the politics of the country, particularly the Catholic groups in America.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned that before, and anytime you've said that, probably because we always end up on these similar subjects. You said that probably every time that I've been on, and I had heard that, but so don't get the. I know you're not going to get the wrong impression, but I don't want anybody in the audience to get the wrong impression that I'm scoffing at what Tim is saying, or that I did. You would say that, and it was like, oh yeah, I think I've heard that before, but I can never verify that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, guess what? In the book that I mentioned, Holy Land, it says right here on page 74. It says that this is a funny thing. You're going to like this. You're going to like this quote, Tim. It said, in Levittown on Long Island in 1953, for reasons no one in the organization has ever explained, the population of new homeowners was 50% Catholic. Okay. The other thing that was not explained is why this was a statistic at all. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what he's saying here, like I said, this is not a conspiratorial book or anything like that. He's basically saying that someone went to the trouble to find out how many people were Catholic who moved into that suburb.
Yeah, they're not gathering that data for benign reasons, right? I mean, the fact that someone is troubling themselves to get all that information tells you that something's afoot. They're going to use this as some sort of psychological warfare scheme or social engineering,
Mm-hmm.
And,
yes.
To deny the existence of a conspiracy in these things is to deny the reality of social engineering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree. So another aspect to this, since we're getting off onto housing here, I just want to bring this up. This is from a book called American Dreamscape, The Pursuit of Happiness in Post-War Suburbia by Tom Martinson. On page 158, he says, the houses and the subdivision itself were the work of Cliff May. Probably few people now remember Mr. May, but he was arguably the most influential post-war residential architect in the United States. May effectively invented the California ranch house that became our national post-war symbol of informal suburban life. Beginning in the 1930s, May's work was extensively featured in Sunset magazine. And by the 1950s, the California lifestyle celebrated by Sunset had firmly entered the national consciousness. Many of us in the Midwest and back east had outwardly dismissed the Los Angeles Southland as nothing more than the home of movie stars and crazies, but in your heart of hearts you knew that California was a paradise. So for millions of Americans living in colder and more prosaic places, the ranch house served as a tangible connection to the good life.